Welcome back, deep divers. This time we're doing things a little differently.
Yeah, trading in the microscopes for rock hammers this time.
Exactly. We're going deep into the world of structural geology.
Which is just a fancy way of saying we're going to learn how to read rocks like a history book.
Love that. And we've got a ton of cool stuff to dig into: textbook excerpts, geological maps, even some recent research papers.
It's going to be a wild ride through time, that's for sure.
I am so ready. So, should we just jump right in?
Let's do it.
Okay, so first up, we've got to talk about unconformities. No, I don't mean like fashion faux pas in the rock world.
Although I'm sure those exist too.
Right, but no, these unconformities, we're talking about gaps in the rock record.
Exactly. Like missing pages in Earth's history book.
Missing pages. So how big are we talking? A few years? A couple centuries?
Way bigger. Sometimes we're talking hundreds of millions of years. Just gone.
Whoa, okay. That is a lot of missing information. So what could cause a gap that massive?
Well, imagine you have a mountain range, right? Over millions of years, it erodes away bit by bit until nothing is left. Those rocks, they don't just disappear, they get broken down into sediment, washed away, maybe even become part of a new rock formation somewhere else entirely.
So it's like the Earth is constantly writing and erasing its own history.
In a way, yeah. But even those erasures, they can tell us a lot. Like sometimes unconformities can trap things like oil and gas.
Really? So they're like hidden treasure maps?
Kind of. There's this really cool example in insert location. Geologists found this random oil deposit. Didn't make any sense with the surrounding geology. Turns out they were looking at a massive unconformity.
So by figuring out what was missing, they figured out where the oil was.
Exactly. The unconformity, it was like a giant clue. It told them that there used to be this massive mountain range there, long gone, and the oil trapped beneath it all along.
Wow, that's incredible. So we've got these missing pieces, these unconformities. But what about the rocks that are still around? They've been through a lot, right?
Oh yeah, rocks have been squeezed, stretched, twisted, you name it. They've seen it all. And the cool thing is they actually hold on to those stories.
They do. You're gonna have to explain this one.
It's all about rock deformation. Basically, how rocks change shape when they're under pressure. And believe it or not, they have their own language.
Okay, now you've got me hooked. Rock language. What is that?
Well, it all starts with understanding how rocks respond to stress.
Stress, like what I feel when I have too many deadlines.
Kind of. But in this case, stress is the force that's pushing or pulling on the rock. And there are three main ways we describe how rocks react to that stress: deformation, displacement, and strain.
Okay, let's break those down. Deformation, that one seems pretty self-explanatory.
Right. It's any change in the shape, the position, anything about how that rock looks compared to how it started. Imagine you're playing with clay. You can squeeze it, twist it, stretch it. All those actions are deformation.
Okay, so what about displacement? How is that different?
Think about it this way. You draw a little smiley face on that clay before you start messing with it. As you deform the clay, that smiley face is going to move, right? Maybe it gets stretched out, maybe it gets all squished. Displacement is just about how far those points within the rock have moved relative to each other.
So it's not just that the overall shape changed, but like how the stuff inside the rock got moved around.
You got it.
Okay, that makes sense. So where does strain fit into all of this?
Strain is all about how much the rock has been deformed, like how much it's been stretched or squeezed or sheared.
Ah, I see. So deformation is like the action and strain is the result.
Boom, exactly.
This is fascinating. So rocks really are telling us stories, but instead of words, it's all about the bends and the breaks.
And trust me, those stories can be pretty wild.
Wow, I am definitely ready to hear more.
So last time we were talking about how rocks get all bent out of shape.
Literally.
Yeah. Deformation, displacement, all because of stress.
Right, exactly. And speaking of stress, did I ever tell you about the time I tried glass blowing?
Oh, is this going where I think it is? Another one of your famous analogies. What can I say? I'm a sucker for a good analogy. But trust me, this one's relevant. So, picture this. Molten glass, glowing orange, crazy hot.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
When it's like that, super hot, you can shape it into anything, bend it, stretch it. It's actually pretty amazing.
But let it cool down for a minute and...
Disaster. Try to bend it then, and it'll snap in two.
Okay, I'm seeing where you're going with this. So rocks, they're kind of like glass.
Sort of. Deep underground, where it's super hot and there's tons of pressure from all the rock layers above. Well, rocks can actually flow, almost like that molten glass. We call it the brittle ductile transition.
Brittle ductile, so like they can be brittle or ductile depending on the temperature.
Exactly. It's all about the conditions. At the surface, a rock might just snap under pressure. But go a few miles down, heat things up a bit, and that same rock might bend and flow like putty.
That is wild. So how do geologists figure out what's going on down there? We can't exactly just dig down that far.
We have our ways. One cool thing is we can actually recreate those extreme conditions in a lab.
Seriously?
Yeah, we've got these incredible machines that can generate tons of pressure and heat.
So you basically have like a miniature Earth in your lab.
You could say that. It's pretty awesome. We can test all kinds of rocks, see how they react to different temperatures and pressures.
That's amazing. So, okay, we've been talking about these big forces, these massive changes, but what about the really, really small stuff? Like what's happening inside the rocks themselves?
Ah, you're thinking like a true geologist. You're right. There's a whole other level of deformation happening at a microscopic scale. We're talking about the individual mineral grains that make up a rock.
Oh, I remember learning about mineral grains. They're like super tiny, right?
Tiny but mighty. Under enough stress, those grains can actually move around, rearrange themselves. They can even dissolve and reform in a new spot.
Wait, what? So the rock is basically like rebuilding itself from the inside out.
Kind of. There's this process called dislocation creep. Basically, there are these tiny imperfections within the crystal structure of a mineral. And when you apply enough stress, those imperfections can actually move, allowing the rock to deform without completely breaking apart.
So the atoms are like scooting around in there.
That's a great way to think about it. It's like a microscopic dance floor, with atoms switching partners as the rock changes shape.
That is incredible. And all of this from those massive folds we see in mountains to those tiny little atoms rearranging themselves. It's all connected.
Absolutely. That's what makes structural geology so fascinating. It's like a giant puzzle. And each piece, no matter how small, helps us understand the bigger picture of how our planet works.
So we've gone deep underground, explored these hidden layers, zoomed in on the microscopic level.
And now it's time to bring it all back to the surface.
Right, back to those massive forces that shape our planet. We got to talk plate tectonics.
It's all connected. Those plates are constantly on the move, bumping into each other, pulling apart.
And I'm guessing those collisions are pretty intense.
You could say that. Imagine two cars in a head-on collision. Now multiply that force by like 1 million.
Okay, ouch.
Yeah, that's basically what happens when two tectonic plates collide. Creates massive amounts of pressure, enough to buckle and fold the Earth's crust.
That's how we get mountains, right?
Exactly. The Himalayas, the Alps, the Andes, all formed by these incredible collisions.
It's mind-boggling how powerful those forces are.
And those forces, they don't always create mountains. Sometimes they cause things to slip and slide a bit.
Slip and slide. You're talking about faults, right?
Bingo. Picture those two plates pushing against each other again, but instead of buckling, they slide horizontally past each other.
Like the San Andreas fault.
Exactly. That's a prime example of a strike-slip fault. Those plates are always moving, building up stress, and every so often, bam, earthquake.
Okay, now I'm starting to feel a little shaky. So we've got collisions, we've got these strike-slip faults. What happens when plates decide to go their separate ways?
Well, that's when things get really interesting. We call that divergence. When plates move apart, they create these massive rifts in the Earth's crust.
Rifts, like giant cracks in the Earth.
Basically, the East African Rift Valley is a great example. It's huge, stretches for thousands of miles, and it's still pulling apart today.
So more earthquakes, more volcanoes.
You got it. Rift zones are like geological hotspots. But here's the really cool part. Those rifts, they can eventually become oceans.
Wait, seriously? Oceans are born from these giant cracks.
That's right. Millions of years ago, the Atlantic Ocean was just a rift valley. Over time, it widened, filled with water, and voila, the Atlantic Ocean.
That is incredible. So everything we've talked about, those bends, those folds, those faults, it's all connected to this massive dance of the continents.
It is. And it's not just about the past. By understanding how plate tectonics work, how rocks behave under pressure, we can actually start to make predictions about the future.
So we could see new mountain ranges forming, continents breaking apart, even new oceans being born.
It's all possible. The Earth is always changing, always moving.
It's a humbling thought, really.
Yeah.
We think of the ground beneath our feet as this solid, unchanging thing.
But in reality, it's anything but. It's dynamic, always evolving.
Well, on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap up this deep dive. But before we go, I want to give a huge thank you to expert speaker's name. This has been an incredible journey.
The pleasure was all mine. Always happy to talk rocks.
And to our amazing listeners, thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the fascinating world of structural geology. Until next time, keep exploring.